up here, wherever you would like. The chief always sits there.
Chief? You want his better?
Be nice to her. She's the chief.
Good morning, sir. Kimberly Greenwood. So while she was there, they used to call me Mark. I went to Ottawa to the CACP and CAPP or whatever it is, present. And a whole week she called me Mark. As I'm leaving the hotel on the last day, I hear these footprints behind me. I hear these footprints behind me, and I think somebody's running past me. So I move to the side, and she grabs me, and she's like, "I have to apologize." I said, "To me?" And she goes, "Yeah, I'm calling you Mark." I go, "I know. Then why did you correct me?" She please. Yeah, you're looking right at me. It's because Mark Barkley and Mike Barsky. Always. Oh, how many times? Did you ever get Mike though? Oh yeah, I've had that. And I get Mike and Mike's emails. People send emails asking me to buy more cameras. Where's this stuff? Thank you, one Mike. They were asking me if I get emotional about my name or rank, and I'm like, for 32 years I've been called something different, so what's the difference? Yeah, yeah, normally at home, but... Morning. Barkley. Good, how are you? Buddy, we're working on that stupid thing with my admin was down last week, so it never got touched. And now we're fighting with obviously phone friendships. So I got people phoning them at home. Some people just don't answer your phone. We're hoping to have it done today. But that's what it is. No, and I get it. And I want to have it done. And we're not just going funky. Like it's so I responded to Andy last night too. I get it. Yeah. And we're doing the best we can, but so I expect that by the time I leave here, it'll all be sorted. Okay. But failing that, just make up some names and then say, "Oh, they changed their name."
That's perfect. I hear that. Okay, can I call this meeting to order? Good morning, everybody. I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Do we have any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Right? No. Seeing none. Move through the agenda now. Item number 1 is the Toronto Police Service 2020 operating budget. We have deputations and a presentation, so that's held. Item number 2 is the Toronto Police Service capital program request. We have a presentation, so that's held. Item number 3 is the Toronto Police Service parking enforcement unit. We have a presentation, so that's held. Item number 4 is the Toronto Police Service Board 2020 operating budget request. Do I have a mover?
I'll move that we pass that item 5, Toronto Police Service 2020 operating budget.
Okay, and I'll second that. That's carried. Okay, Tony, over to you for the presentation.
Good morning. I think we're going to
Good, you're on.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to preface what the budget team, Tony and his team, have put together, a budget that is both looking at our context, the things that we have seen over the past couple of years leading us to today, but it's also a forward-looking budget. And it is a budget that has been put together for our Toronto context. And it really speaks to some of the outcomes that we want to achieve, both public safety, pedestrian and traffic safety, as well as our ability to continue making partnerships and inroads with our communities and our neighborhoods. So it is a budget that balances a number of needs and priorities, particularly what you will hear from Tony, that Toronto is a growing city. We are seeing increased calls for service and a changing nature of crime and disorder in our city, and that is causing us to look at how we are delivering. We are driving our modernization plan forward, and if we are going to meet the needs of an increasing city with increasing population and density, we need both innovation and investment, and that all of those principles have been taken into consideration as we present our budgets for both operating capital and parking enforcement. And before Tony and his team get going, I want to say a big thank you, because I know there has been a ton of work that has been put into today. So over to you.
Thank you, Deputy.
So good morning, Chair Hart, Vice Chair Molnar. We are really pleased to be here today to present the Toronto Police Services 2020 operating budget request, our 2020 to 29 capital budget request, as well as our 2020 parking enforcement unit budget request. Assisting me with the presentation today is our Acting Director of Finance and Business Management, Cindy Grant. But I also want to acknowledge the work of Cindy's team, and in particular, Magda Gizar, Andrew Chernowski, and Denisa Sipersad, who did all the heavy lifting and actually got us to where we are here today. So we continue to be guided by the Way Forward report, and that report essentially is our strategic plan in terms of how we move forward as an organization. And if we'll, just as a reminder, those goals were to basically be where the public needs us the most, to embrace and engage and create partnerships with community stakeholders, and to focus on the needs of a complex and growing city. And so our budget priorities are basically to maintain our current staffing levels, ensure that they're properly resourced, both uniform and civilian, to enable our capabilities to move forward with the plan, and in doing so, to be fiscally responsible, disciplined, and accountable for delivering those services in the best and most cost-effective way possible. So our vision is basically to be intelligence-led, with a focus not only on reactive policing, but also preventative policing, the proactive piece that's so important to ensuring that we work with our partners to create public safety. We want to be not only technologically advanced, but enabled. So where we can use technology to reduce our reliance on human resources, to create efficiencies, we want to invest and be able to invest in those opportunities. And as I said before, we need to be properly resourced because it's the people that actually make all of this work, both uniform and civilian. So let's just go back to the way forward, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we've basically achieved $100 million in savings from in the last 3 years from the recommendations in the Way Forward report. A lot of that was done through a moratorium or hiring freeze. And we achieved 0% increases, and that includes the collective agreement in 17 and 18, and I think have kept our increases at a responsible level probably for the last 5 to 10 years. In terms of what we've achieved, our parking complaints were a significant amount of the calls that we've received. And so now we've given the public the opportunity to file those complaints online. We've basically disbanded the Transit Patrol Unit. We've created a public safety data portal so that the public can go to that portal and see what's happening in terms of, from a public safety perspective. We civilianized, and this is an important one, a lot of roles that were traditionally done by police officers. We've looked at what police officers do and basically said, you don't need the authority or the force of a police officer to do those things, and so we've civilianized, and a good example of that is the District Special Constable Program, where by the end of 2020, we will have 136 special constables in our service that basically do some of the work that officers used to do. And so that is done. We've increased the number in terms of positions, but certainly if we had to do that work with police officers, it would have cost us at least $25,000 more per person. We established the Priority Response Group, which is basically a demand-based surge capacity group that goes where we're experiencing high call volumes. We've also established a public safety response team that helps us with community engagement, response to calls, but also is able to quickly move to deal with extreme events. We deployed on a pilot basis 700 connected devices or mobile devices as part of our Connected Officer program. And so those are all the things that we've completed, but our work is nowhere near done. We continue to redirect calls to our city partners, both municipal licensing as well as 311. We're moving forward on the first phase of the Next Generation 911 project. We're moving forward and doing a lot of work with respect to our district policing model that better aligns our services to city neighborhoods, but also ensures that the processes that we use in the delivery of those services are the most cost-effective and value-added as possible. Information is critical. And so we have ANCO, which is Analytics Center of Excellence, to ensure that the information that our people have is reliable, it's up to date, it's real time, because they rely on that information both from a decision-making as well as operational perspective. And we're using technology. We're moving forward to robotics to actually reduce our reliance on human resources. And we've got a pilot project that's underway now, and we plan on doing another one in the very near future. We're going to be expanding our Connected Officer, and this is where this program gives our officers the mobility to do and get out of the cars and get out of the station and basically do work in the community. We're going to add another 2,100 officers to that program, increasing it to 2,800 officers by the end of 2020, and that's going to be funded from the provincial grant. And we're also expanding our neighborhood officer program, which will allow us to be in 10 more neighborhoods right across the city. So all of those are things that are on the go, and there's a lot more happening, and we'll talk about some of those things further later on in our budget. The deputy talked about context, and so the city is growing tremendously. It grew by 170,000 people between 2015 and 2018. We're expecting that it's going to grow between 2015 and 2023 by another 500,000 people, which is basically the size of Hamilton. And that is going to put demands and pressures not only on public safety, but other city programs. And so we need to ensure that our processes are aligned with that growth and that we make those necessary investments to deal with those challenges. Because with growth also comes more calls for service, increased traffic, potentially more crime, more city events. And more city events doesn't just translate to the events themselves, but also the nature and the level of resources that are required to actually ensure that those events are safe. When you look at us compared to other large urban centers, you'll see that per 100,000, we're at about 167 officers. Compared to Vancouver, which is at 198, compared to Montreal, which is 223. So we're well below the other major urban cities. We used to be probably, I'd say 7, 8 years ago, over 200 officers. So what has happened is our population has grown, our number of officers has decreased, and so the per capita is much lower than it once was. But we're also, remember, civilianizing some of our functions. So not included in that number is those civilianization initiatives that we've taken forward. The other thing in terms of context is crime. From 15 to 18, crime basically went up in every category. And when you look at 18 to 19 year to date, it's gone up in every category except robbery and homicide. So we're dealing with more crime. Next. We're also dealing with other challenges, persons in crisis, mental health challenges, overdosed, threatened suicide. All of those calls are up, and the time that we spend dealing with those calls has also gone up, again putting a time pressure on our resources. Shootings have gone up significantly from 15 to 18 and continue to go up in 18 to 19. So that's certainly an area that the chief and command have their eye on in terms of taking steps to try to reduce that violence. And then there's legislative impacts that are beyond our control that we have to deal with. There is the legalization of cannabis that's caused more work for us. There is the R versus Jordan, which basically says you've got to complete a case to end within 18 months. And so that puts in pressure on investigative units. There's the disclosure of 911 tapes, presumptive PTSD legislation that basically has put a pressure on our budget, as well as Next Generation 911, which Cindy will talk about later. So the time spent on call is up. Some of the legislative things or new legislation has caused pressures, but calls for service
The base budget, that is the amount that's needed to maintain our current service levels, and the new investments that are required to address the challenges and the workload drivers that the CAO just talked about. The base budget request represents 2.9% out of our total increase of 3.9%.
Can I interrupt just for 1 second? Apparently our live stream just went down. So maybe we'll just pause this for a minute
Okay.
to see if it comes right back up.
You're not advancing.
Oh, sorry, I'm the advancer. Are you looking at this?
No. A little bit. But I have to do this too.
Okay, sorry about that. Continue, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so our base budget request represents 2.9% out of the 3.9% increase that we have over 2019. The lion's share of this increase is for the collective agreements that were negotiated between the board, the Toronto Police Association, and the Senior Officers Organization. And that accounts for almost $29 million, or 2.8% of the increase. The remaining 0.1%, or just $800,000, is attributed to all of the other changes in the base budget, which I will explain in the following slides. The most significant part of our budget is the base salary requirements. These requirements represent a small pressure on the budget with only a 0.7% increase. The base budget maintains the current complement of 4,850 officers and 2,490 civilians. And this allows for us to fill about 150 critical civilian vacancies, such as our communications operators and our records management staff. It builds in funding for previous year decisions, such as civilianization of certain positions, like the district special constables and the crime analysts. And also, a notable impact on the budget is the added day in 2020, which adds a cost of $1.9 million. Of course, this cost will come off in the 2021 budget. The breakdown of the premium pay category of our budget can be seen in the pie chart on the slide. Premium pay is the cost for members working outside of their regular working hours, such as attendance at court, which represents about 1/3 of our premium pay costs, overtime when members stay beyond their regular shift to meet a call or to meet deadlines or complete a call, and also callback when members work additional shifts to help us meet operational needs. The graph at the right shows the relationship between premium pay and staffing levels. The blue bars represent the staff, and the line represents our premium pay spending. And you can see if you look at the graph that there's an inverse relationship between the amount of staff that we have and the amount of premium pay that we spend. When we had higher levels of staff, you can see that the premium pay spending was lower. Last year and this year, due to our reduced staffing levels, premium pay has reached a very unsustainable level. This is from a financial, an operational, and from a member well-being perspective. So the budget includes a reduction of $6 million in premium pay as we add staff to meet our operational needs. But it must be noted that there are some risks to achieving that reduced level of premium pay, as it's premised on building our numbers of staff, implementing a new shift schedule, as well as what the service demands will be. The pie chart on this slide shows the breakdown of our statutory deductions and benefits. The largest piece is for our OMERS pension plan, and that represents about 40% of the pie. And the increases in this category are primarily related to two things. One, the medical and dental claims that have been steadily rising, which accounts for $700,000 of the increase in this category, and the WSIB costs that continue to put a pressure on our budget with the introduction of the legislation around presumptive PTSD a couple of years ago. And this accounts for a $1.4 million pressure on our budget. Here you can see the breakdown of our reserve contributions. Both the sick pay gratuity reserve and the insurance reserve are managed by the city, and the city determines how much we contribute to those reserves. Central Sick Bank is the equivalent of LTD for us, and the largest contribution that we make to reserves is to the vehicle and equipment reserve. This year, in order to meet current and future requirements of these reserves, we determined that we needed an incremental contribution of $3.8 million in 2020. However, this amount has not been included in the budget, as we plan to request the contribution from this year's surplus in accordance with the city's surplus management policy. The increased contribution level will need to be reflected, though, in the 2021 budget. Other expenditures amount to $80 million in this budget. The largest of those is our IT system maintenance expenditures that come in at about $22 million. This category also includes expenditures like our operating costs to keep our cars running, such as gas, tires, parts, and uniforms for our officers. Some costs are going up in this category. As we add technology, our computer maintenance costs increase, and as capital projects end, we need to include the costs in our operating budget to maintain those assets and for the ongoing support. We also buy our fuel through a joint contract with the city, and the 8-cent increase that we included in our gas is based on the city estimated rate. Despite these increases, you can see overall that we have decreased this category by $1 million, and this is primarily because of savings from the completion of our transition to voice over internet protocol and various other expenditure reductions, like reductions in ammunition. Our revenue budget is going up by $2.9 million, and this reflects the increases that we have seen in paid duty rental revenue and criminal reference check revenue. Also new this year, the city has approved a draw from the Reserve for Cannabis-related enforcement for costs that we are incurring for training, for targeting illegal dispensaries, for the impacts on our frontline demands, as well as the processing and destruction of seized cannabis. The city's reserve was built from funds that they received from the Ontario Cannabis Legalization Implementation Fund. And that concludes the portion of the budget that relates to our base budget. And you will see on the slide now, this is a summary of the enhancements that we're looking to make in 2020. These new investments are designed for public safety impact, and they comprise $11 million, or a 1% increase over the 2019 budget. I'm going to give you some more detail on each of these key investments. First and foremost, we're investing in people. This is where we know we can have the biggest impact on public safety. We've talked today about the challenges that we're facing as a service with increased calls, increases in major crimes, the changing nature of crime, and importantly, the significant growth in the population of the city. Our goal is to be where the public needs us most, and this investment will help us get there. There are 4 groups of service members that I'll be talking to you about, totaling 188 officers and 5 civilians. It's important to note that the onboarding of the 188 net new officers will take place over time, due to the ebbs and flows in the numbers of officers that we have at any given time. About 230 officers are estimated to retire or leave in 2020, and 341 hires are planned to replace those officers and to make the needed investment in net new officers. You'll see on the right-hand side that we will add 80 officers on an average deployed basis in 2020, and by 2021 we will reach the full complement that includes the 188 net new officers. Now I'd like to turn to some detail about how we arrived at the 188 new officers that we require. And first I'll walk you through the priority response unit, and then the neighborhood officers, and then finally the Vision Zero team. The addition of the 140 priority response unit officers is the largest new investment of 2020. The number of 140 officers came through a significant amount of research and consultation, and an external specialist was engaged that specialized in police scheduling, and the specialist looked at demand, response time international standards, goals for proactive policing, and the amount of time that officers spend on vacation, training, or sick time, anything that takes them away from doing their job. The analysis determined that 140 would be the amount of additional officers that would be required for a proper staffing model of the priority response unit. We can achieve this with 140 officers for two significant reasons. The first is that we have an agile priority response group unit that allows officers to be more immediately available across the city for calls for service. And secondly, and most importantly, we are moving to a new shift schedule that will allow for strategic placement of our officers at peak hours. This new shift schedule is the single largest change that we've done. Notably, the shift schedule change represents a significant positive collaboration between this board, the TPS, and the TPA. This investment is designed to improve response time, to reduce victimization, and to help us to provide more proactive policing. And I should add that this investment will also help to improve officer wellness with the improved shift schedules, with the reduced reliance on premium pay, and a renewed focus on more proactive work, such as traffic enforcement and responding to community safety concerns. I'd like to turn now to this budget's investment in Toronto neighborhoods. The evidence is clear. Community-based policing is more proactive and serves as a deterrent to crime. It is also what we continually hear from the public. They want more officers dedicated and visible in their neighborhoods. This is why we're enhancing our neighborhood community officer program with an investment of 40 officers that will expand the program to 10 new neighborhoods. In 2019, Council passed a decision to accelerate the implementation of the neighborhood program, and this investment is responsive to Council's call. Outcomes that will contribute to this investment are better engagement with the community, a reduced crime and victimization, increased public safety, and an improvement in trust with the police. As you are aware, there has been considerable discussion and concern from citizens and the City of Toronto on traffic and pedestrian safety. This is why we're determined to help ensure that we have a fully dedicated team for traffic enforcement. And today, for context, the Traffic Services Unit is staffed by 127 officers who are focused on collision investigations and frontline traffic enforcement. Collisions are, of course, after the fact, and traffic enforcement is proactive policing that helps to establish a culture of driver awareness and attention. That is why it's important to establish a fully dedicated, intelligence-led team that focuses entirely on enforcement. And this investment is being supported from a $1 million allocation from the City of Toronto's Vision Zero Road Safety Plan. I'd like to now highlight our 2020 investment in civilian positions to help us serve the city better. This investment of $400,000 in equity, inclusion, and human rights will allow us to hire 5 new civilian experts that brings the size of the unit to 10 people. The focus of these new roles will be on implementing the service's race-based data collection strategy, as well as the promotion of a healthy work environment and the establishment of a center of excellence. As a service in a city as diverse as Toronto, it's vitally important that we have an appropriately sized team to provide leadership in this field. Finally, I'd like to turn to our technology investment in 2020. Body-worn cameras are a technology solution to increasing public trust and accountability. It will help the service deliver on its commitment to unbiased policing, and it's critically important technology for a modern service in a modern city. We've done significant work consulting with our officers in the community to determine the right solution, including a previous pilot and an examination of our lessons learned from that pilot. The reaction was quite positive and supportive, And a cost of $4.8 million is included in our capital program for the infrastructure and device requirements. The operating budget will reflect $2.5 million investment in a cloud-based solution, and we plan for this implementation to begin in mid-2020. And this brings us to the end of the new investment component of the budget. And now I'd like to walk you through where the money comes from the overall budget, and where it goes. The pie chart on the left shows you that our net budget of $1.076 billion comes from property taxes. The balance comes from various other revenue sources like provincial recoveries and reserves. And on the right, you will see where the funds are spent. 89% of the budget is spent on people through our salaries, our benefits, and our premium pay. The other 11% funds our day-to-day operational expenses that we talked about earlier. Now, looking forward in our outlook, based on what we know now, knowing what our current staffing levels are, knowing, anticipating continued grant funding levels and economic indicators, we would see an increase of 3.6% in 2021 and an increase of just over 4% in 2022. But this is subject to things that may come online, like NG 911. And also, with the continued growth in calls for service in a growing city, that might require additional investments in the future.
So just to recap, the $1.76 billion investment is a 3.9% increase over 2019. And it will basically enable us to hire 341 officers on top of the over 400 that we've hired this year, to replace those officers that retire, but also invest in the priority areas that Cindy just described. It includes the hiring of 150 critical civilian positions, and I can't overstate the importance of these civilians. Without these civilians, the frontline officers and other support functions in the service simply would not be able to do the job, so it's important that that investment be made. It'll also result in improved response time and proactive policing with the new shift schedule. And again, as Cindy pointed out, this is something that's been on the radar, I guess, for the last 2 to 3 decades, but has finally reached fruition and is really an important piece of how we move forward in our organization, because it will allow officers to have more time to actually be and focus on preventative public safety activities. We are we're enhancing traffic and pedestrian safety as one piece of that whole safety program. There's going to be greater community engagement and partnerships through neighborhood officers, but also because of the proactive piece that our PRU officers will have. We're going to improve, as Cindy pointed out, public trust and accountability through some of those neighborhood officers, but also through body-worn cameras. And the budget also attempts to increase the wellness and deal with some of the burnout issues and stress issues that our members are feeling, both on the uniform and civilian side. And finally, it will result in a healthy and inclusive work environment that's free of harassment and discrimination. So that concludes the presentation on our operating budget. We're now going to move forward to our capital budget request. And so the nature of a capital program is to really make those long-term investments that aren't day-to-day activities. They're intended to be very strategic in nature and basically enable our operating objectives. And so in our 2020 to 29 capital program is a budget of $587 million gross and $202 million net. Our capital program is funded by 3 sources. The first source is the debt, the second source is through reserves, and the third source is through development charges. And so when you take development charges and the reserves out of the equation, the city will be borrowing about $22 million in 2020 and $202 million over the full 10 years of the program to enable our the investments that we need to make. And this chart here basically shows where we're spending the money, and you can see it's in facilities, information technology, vehicles. communication and equipment. Some of this, again, is just day-to-day stuff that we need to do, but also there's some very strategic investments there in terms of information technology and infrastructure. Part of, so our body-worn camera right now, based on, and we don't know what that solution is going to look like yet because we're still in the middle of the evaluation, but will probably involve an operating component that Cindy talked about, as well as a capital budget component, which is really the infrastructure and the devices. The district policing model is really, it's facilities, but facilities driven not by bricks and mortar, but more about how we want to operate as a service. So we are building facilities that basically will facilitate both current as well as changing processes that we are moving forward, and prisoner management is an example of that. So we are investing heavily in facilities to renovate and build new facilities, but driven by the business in terms of how those facilities are designed to best meet our needs. It also respect the fact that, or take into account the fact that we want our officers on the street, so the need for space for officers in the division is significantly reduced. I talked about information and the Analytics Center of Excellence. That is important in terms of making sure we have reliable information that's real time. Next Generation 911, this is the first phase of a very, very large project. And so we have funds in both 2020 and 2021 to enable us to carry out that first phase, which really is the ability then to do real-time texting so that people can actually text our 911 operators. And finally, it's just a bunch of life cycle replacements for vehicles and computer equipment. So it's important, I think, for the board budget committee to realize that the first phase of the next generation 911 is about a $10 million investment. The second phase is much larger. So if you can picture a communication operator now that basically deals with calls, in the future that operator will deal with text messages, video, and so the amount of time that's going to be required for that person to deal with these calls is going to increase exponentially. Now we're going to do our best to use technology to reduce and mitigate some of that pressure, but there is going to be a need to expand our facility, to bring in new equipment, and that, and I want to stress, is not in our budget. But we see that as an investment that's a city-wide investment with our emergency service partners. As much as we are the ones that manage and run the communications center, we actually provide and dispatch to fire, EMS, and other parts of the city. So our position on this, and we've had discussions with the city on it, is that this be a project that's going to be funded, at least phase 2, in the city. We are looking at partnerships with 311 so that we perhaps can do a consolidated facility. These are all things that we're going to be considering in terms of moving forward, and there will be more information in next year's budget in terms of how that's going to work out, but there's going to be a number of discussions that will take place before that actually happens. And so that's our parking enforcement budget, and our capital budget, and now we move forward to parking enforcement. So parking enforcement is not included in the services operating budget. It is actually part of the city's parking tag operations program, which include our parking enforcement unit, but also the collection of fines is done by the city. The scheduling and support of the administrative penalty tribunal is done by the city, and the managing of and administrating of the dispute review is also done by the city. So the revenue that comes from the enforcement that our parking enforcement officers goes to the city, not to the service. And if you look at our budget for parking enforcement, it's a $49.2 million ask, which is a $4.1 million increase over 2019. Again, 86% of that budget is people, and our complement right now is 394, but we're wanting to increase that complement by 10 to 404 temporarily to deal with certain issues that we're currently facing. Our successes and our considerations are, there's a number of initiatives that parking enforcement carried out in 2019. Rush hour route enforcement, the heavy truck engagement campaign, the Queen Street pilot project, which you remember is to move vehicles to around the corner, so to speak. We've issued 2 million parking tags. We towed about 30,000 vehicles, and we responded to 150 calls for parking complaints. One of the things that we've experienced in 2019, and one of the reasons that we're asking to go temporarily above 10, is a lot of our parking enforcement officers have been successful in getting positions either as district special constables or as recruits. And so we lost about 90 people last year to those, which is a good thing. But it does put tremendous pressure on the unit. Now, we don't expect that pressure will continue into 2020. But nonetheless, there will be, I guess, a pressure that's greater than what we've been experiencing in the past. And so what we're suggesting that in order to keep our enforcement to where we want it to be and where we should be, that we go temporarily up above 10, above our complement by 10 in 2020. We'll revisit that in 2020 and then determine whether we actually need to do that on an extended basis or not. So that represents about $600,000 of the actual increase in 2020. And so you can see this just summarizes the increase. Again, the biggest part of the increase of 4.1 is the collective agreement requires at 1.5%. The salary, or the salary requirements are 1.5%. The collective agreement is 2%. And everything else is pretty well flat. The net increase, as I indicated before, is 4.1% over last year's budget. And that concludes, Mr. Chair, our budget presentations.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I'll ask you to take your seats to the side while I call on the deputants, and then we'll bring you back for some questions. I'd like to call the first deputant, Mr. Sewell. Welcome. We'll start your clock whenever you say you're ready.
So we've submitted a letter, as you know, and I just wanted to summarize it relatively quickly. First point I wanted to make is that it's not stated clearly in the budget documents, but if you add up the figures, you can see that the staffing increase in the last 3 years has been almost 10%. That's the proposal. That's very, very significant. You look at the rest of the city staff, this is not happening anywhere else. And so I think what the board has to do is tell the service to look very carefully at how you can pursue efficiencies. And we have 3 suggestions on that. We agree very much with the idea of hiring, of making sure that you've got more priority response unit staff and community officers and traffic enforcement and the equity inclusion. We don't disagree that you need those people on that. The question is where you get them, and as to whether, in fact, you hire from without for some of those, such as as most of them, or whether, in fact, you can find room within the current service to actually dedicate those officers. And in that regard, we have 3 suggestions, and these are all suggestions we've made in the past. And in fact, in each of the 3, we have produced papers which we've presented to this board about 2 years ago, suggesting that these are good places for efficiencies. The first one is shift schedules. As you know, the current shift schedule says there's as many officers on board at 4 a.m. as at 7 p.m., which is, if a hospital did that, we'd be yelling and screaming. This is crazy. And secondly, the shift schedule calls for officers to work 28 hours in every 24-hour period. Again, this is bizarre. If any other organization did that, it would be awful. And we pushed hard, and last year, in fact, there was a decision to go ahead and start changing the shift schedule. We had a meeting with staff. It was very informative. We thought that, hey, this is really good. They were moving ahead in, I think it was 41 division. And what we're surprised at is that in the last year, there doesn't seem to be much more movement at all on this. The chief mentions there's a couple of divisions where, well, I guess that means 2. But we think that not enough attention is being made to implement that quickly enough. Now, I know that their thought is that that's going to be implemented in this coming year, Well, that's what we thought when we met with staff more than a year ago. It was going to be, and in fact, very little has been done. There's a lot of staff resources that can be shifted by having a more reasonable shift schedule. And we think that's one place, in fact, you should be finding a lot of staff. We were disappointed that the budget documents don't show the impact of the shift schedule. It talked about, you mentioned that in fact shift schedule is going to, but we have no idea how many officers you're talking about there. We think it's a sizable number. Secondly, two officers in a car after dark. We know that in the collective agreement there's now some wiggle room about that management is allowed to get around that rule of requiring two officers in a car after dark. There's obviously some situations where you want two officers in a car after dark, no question about that. But many of the situations don't require it. Most police forces in Canada don't have two officers in a car after dark. There's an awful lot of resources, again, that can be shifted from that. But in fact, we don't see that reflected in the budget, and we think that's a big problem. And the third area is an area that's not referred to at all, called pre-charge screening. This now takes place in 3 other jurisdictions in Canada: New Brunswick, Quebec, British Columbia, where what happens is that the Crown sits down with officers and does sort of a pre-screen about the charges that'll be laid. The experience in Quebec is that you save an extraordinary number of resources on this from officers going to court. Why? Because now in Quebec, not too many cases are thrown out by the courts, whereas in Ontario, it's almost half the cases. So you could save a lot of money, and I noticed in premium pay, the statement was made, a third of premium pay has to do with officers going to court. Well, that would represent almost $18 million a year. You can reduce the number of officers in court by pre-charge screening. You'll be saving a lot of money. Now, there were 2 experiments that were carried out on pre-charge screening by the previous Liberal government. One was, I think it was 52 Division, and the second was in Ottawa, Central Police Station in Ottawa. I have no idea what the data is on that. That's not something the new government wants to talk about. But in fact, you people might have some experience about that. Your officers might have some experience about it. We think there's a lot of savings that could happen there. So there are 3 areas where we think there's very significant efficiencies that can be achieved, and that there's no need to hire new officers. You can actually reassign people from those three areas. So we're basically saying that we don't believe the service should be hiring a lot of new people. I think there'd be hiring 200 replacement officers for those people who are retiring, as well as others. And I would note that if you don't hire new staff, you can have a significant good impact on budgets in future years. We heard the data this morning about next year, 3.6% increase, the year after that, 4% increase. Well, if you hire from within, you aren't going to have those kinds of increases. So they're all 3 things that we think the board should be looking at very clearly and giving instructions to the service to ensure that, in fact, that we aren't continuing to solve problems by hiring new people. The last point I wanted to make is about body-worn cameras. I think the last time body-worn cameras were before the board for a full discussion was in 2016. I went over our records, and as far as I can see, that's when the big report came on body-worn cameras. And it was a really stunning report, simply because of some of the things that it said. And in the letter here, I quote documents, things from the actual report itself. A relatively small number of officers wore the camera. There was no significant incident or situation that arose that would have provided an opportunity for the cameras or video to demonstrate the value or lack thereof for police accountability and public trust. That's from your report. That's not us. That's from the police report. So this idea it's going to create public trust, the data's not there for that at the moment. It says that there were only a small number of officers involved in the report, and the report actually said, quote, the quantitative results were not compelling. That's the police report. That's not us. And they said that no cases of body-worn camera evidence went to court, so it's impossible to assess the use of the cameras in court. And then, of course, there's no rules about when cameras are going to be turned on. That's not been settled. That's a really, really contentious issue. I guess that's the reason it wasn't settled in that report. It's a very difficult issue. When do you turn them on? You've got the privacy commissioner saying, hey, there are problems here, folks. The point is, none of these issues have been resolved. And saying you're going to put $2.5 million in the budget, or a bit more than that, in order to start in this program when none of that resolved, doesn't make any sense. One should get serious about that. There are a number of police forces now that have said, we aren't going ahead with body cameras. We don't think they're of any value. Some police forces have gone ahead. We'd be very interested in seeing the data that is on those, because if a number of police forces have made the positive decision no, we've got to understand why they didn't agree with the ones who think it was a good idea. So we think that that's an area of expenditure that you should be saying, we're putting that on hold. We're going to try and resolve these issues before we go ahead. So there are the points that we'd make. We think you should be doing something on those efficiencies, and you should be putting on hold the body cameras. The last thing I'd like to say is I'd love to get a copy of that external report on the demand for current primary response unit officers. I know it was referred to, and it was the report that was apparently used in order to establish the new 140 officers. I'm not quarreling with it. It might be right. I'd love to see that report, and if that would be available, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sewell. I gave you an extra 5 minutes because you were talking about operating and capital, so I gave you 10 minutes. So have you wrapped up?
Okay.
You have another couple minutes if you need it.
I don't have any comments on this.
Okay, thank you, sir. I'll be asking the service about your deputation.
Thank you.
Miguel? Welcome.
You're welcome. Good morning. Can you hold my time? Can I have
Sure.
a cup of water?
Sure,
please?
just let us know when you're ready.
Yes. Thank you, Leah. Deep breath exercise. I'm gonna be okay. All right, so let's start this. My 5 minutes of glory. Thank you, Jim, for the opportunity to meet you at the end of the last board meeting in regards Vision Zero that we're talking today in the 8 additional police officers. We talk about visibility, and 2 days later, Councilor Kathy Lay from Scarborough North, I believe, she, with Peter Young, Inspector Peter Young, were advertising these colorful armbands to make them visible, the seniors. I think it's a proactive idea. But I would like to emphasize my reputation with regards to bike users. There are many visible items that you can find at bike shops or the dollar store as well, such as glow-in-the-dark gloves and vests. You can get it from the Value Village stores these days, a very cheap $2. So we had to promote a cultural change for our seniors, our people in this, they use motorized devices, like scooters, etc., bicycles users specifically. Thank you for the opportunity to take my comments on that regards, off camera, by the way. So number two, last September, again, Inspector Peter Young, who's not here today, he came to our neighborhood, Regent Park, to talk about the community officers. And I promised him that I was going to ask the board the question that he couldn't answer to me. It was regarding the uniform. I think, like Mr. Sewell says, we have come to speak many times, many years, and we have history on record that we have spoken and the way the uniform reflects to especially members of our youth. It's intimidating. They get scared. They prefer to avoid the police because of their heavily military-style uniform. We had to tone it down so that we can, create those bridges with the community that you have always spoken in part of the city anti-black racism, right? It's one of the things that we need to do to how we can do that. We had to tone it down the uniform, just like Inspector McLean. Look at the white T-shirt. She doesn't. I don't feel threatened by it, and I have mental illnesses. I don't. But if I see another uniform like the guy over there in blue, I feel intimidated. I feel threatened. Anyway, that's the story for another day. With regards the two police per car officers, we agree with Mr. Sewell that it should be less. It should be one per car, because if the body-worn camera project gets approved, that officers will feel safe. It will protect the reputation of these police services. It will accelerate the removal of bad police officers who are in duty, and speed up those legal cases where he says, she says, I am accused of that, but there is no video evidence. So, another thing I want to talk about, mental health. Oh my God, mental health is so part of the conversation these days. We have an interesting conversation with Councilor Christine Wontan in my community. As you probably are aware, the downtown east has 32% of people are being with drug overdoses. So we have a really serious problem in downtown east. So regarding the community officers, again, what I would like to encourage and motivate the police officers is to use compassion. Compassion as you deal with people. Because you have no idea, many of these people who are in the streets right now, they were before good people. Before they fall into the cracks of society, they become, addicted to drugs, addicted to alcohol, and they lose control of their lives. I want to bring something to you important. These posters. It says 75% of all suicides in Canada are men. So you need to, please, community police officers, treat all the men with special compassion and care. And please refer them to them when they find themselves having trouble getting back to their families. We have to practice more mediation. We need to practice more parent sharing. But again, this is a topic for another day. Give me another minute, please. I know that you...
I ask you to wrap up.
Okay, thank you. With regards to the body cameras, I would like to see implemented with the Toronto Community Housing Corporation officers, the CSU officers, and the TTC special transfer fare inspectors, because we need to have them accountable as well. Because you know what happened last February when we were, it's shameful that one kid got arrested for $2.25. And that's what I can say today. I got so many things to say, but I don't think I have more time today. But I did my best.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. Appreciate that. Mm-hmm. Can I bring the staff back, please?
You have a hot seat.
Okay, we'll take this into committee now. Ms. Mulliner, do you have questions of staff?
Thank you. Good morning. First of all, let me commend staff on the way the information has been presented this year. I think it is perhaps the clearest information presentation that I've seen in my time on the board. And so I really know that at the end of the day, what looks simple is complicated behind the scenes, and really appreciate the time and effort that's been taken to present this information. I'd like to talk about, and it may be something that you referenced, the numbers that were raised in Mr. Sewell's presentation, and perhaps we can start with that. And did you have a very specific, because you mentioned you wanted to speak about that as well? Thank you. I have the paper copy of Mr. Sewell's presentation. Have you seen that presentation? And so the numbers that are flagged show it's the 10% increase reference that Mr. Sewell is making. I think it's important that we understand how he's presented it, and I'd like to hear from you how you would explain it. Thank you.
So I'll start it off, and then certainly Deputy McLean can chip in as required. I think just to add a little bit of context to this, at one time we were at 5,600 officers and 2,050 civilians. We then moved down as a result of civilianization to about 5448 and 2230 civilians. If I just look at the numbers that Mr. Sewell's put forward today, and I think there is a small error on the 2019 uniform number, it should be 10 more. Basically, the increase is really occurred on the civilian side, where we've invested with the board's support in district special constables. We needed communication operators to ensure that we met NENA standards, and so that's the first most critical piece. So we hired 50 officers there, another 136 are going to be hired as special constables. We've made it an investment in our human resources to transform our human resources function. That added, I think, about 23 positions. We've civilianized crime analysts. This was work that was previously done by uniforms. So the uniform number has gone down quite significantly from where it was, and the civilian number has gone up to basically deal with risk, but also to civilianize and have work done by those that have the proper experience and credentials to do so. We have come down quite significantly on the uniform side. If you remember, even in 2015, we were probably at around 5,300. So now we're going to be at 4,960 on average next year, and then by the end of the year, we'll be at 4,960. Sorry. So a lot of this change has been as a result of investments that we've made in civilianization, and now we need to make investments on the uniform side as well, because of the new initiatives that we talked about previously, and that's the PRU 140, 40 more officers in neighborhoods, and 8 more officers in traffic. So that basically reconciles, I guess, Mr. Sewell's numbers to what we see.
And so to take this to the next observation, which is that Mr. Sewell has suggested that there be a redistribution of work with the existing service before we would bring in new service. So this may be a question for Acting Chief McLean. I think that that's an important observation, because as you'll know from the Modernization Task Force, we've been looking at how, and the Chief speaks consistently about redeploying people, having them in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing. So I think it's important that if this number is going to be characterized as a 10% increase, and I'm not sure that that's exactly how we are characterizing it, that we understand why or what we put in place beforehand to ensure that we looked at all options before increasing the service levels on both the uniform and the civilian side. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There was something that I've kind of remembered from Mr. Sewell's deputation, and that is to do what he is suggesting would have a good impact on our budget. And so I'm going to suggest that that good impact on our budget has already happened. And so, one, the service is not the same as it was in 2016 when we started the modernization journey, and we held our last 2 budgets to a 0% increase. And I thought that Tony and his team has done fantastic job of really painting the picture of what we have seen over those years, as well as what we are going to see going forward. And so if everything had stayed the same, I might agree with Mr. Sewell. But in fact, what we're seeing is increased calls for service, and the seriousness of some of those increased calls for service, which requires a very labor-intensive response. So you're seeing that shootings are up. You're seeing other violent calls for service that are up that require a very a staffing response that is more numerous than some others. So we have taken some steps to improve our service delivery. So we're looking at online reporting. You know, you heard that some of the less serious calls for service are down. We're trying to get that right resource in the right place so that we can be fiscally responsible and use the expertise that is required so that we can free our officers up for those imminent threat to life and property calls. And so we're not the same. Toronto is not the same as it was even last year. You've seen the growth that Tony and his team have suggested, that our population increase over the next couple of years is going to be the same as adding another city, that being Hamilton, to us. And so the conditions are not the same. The service is not the same. So we are reorganizing. I'd like to also respond to Mr. Sewell's comment about the shift schedules. Absolutely, that has been a challenging issue that has been talked about for many years, and we are seeing movement as of January 27th when 12 of our stations move to a new shift schedule. And so there has been work on that. So it's not a matter of stay the same, ask for more. There's been a lot of changes in our service delivery. There's been a lot of changes in our environment which actually place the demands on our members. And so that would be my response to this.
I would just add that we could have asked for just more based on the calls for service and how much time we spent on calls. But I think we did it responsible. We hired an external expert that actually came in and looked at each division in terms of call for service. So it wasn't cookie cutter. We looked at what each division actually experiences and is expected to experience. And then basically based on that, as well as our objectives of 70-30 and being in the right place at the right time, all of those were taken into account, and the number that came up from a total perspective was 140. But I can tell you, some divisions that have actually will go down, and other divisions will go up based on their demographic and their levels of service that are required, and the types of crime that they're actually dealing with within those communities. So, you know, that's how we came up with the 140. I can't tell you what the number might have been if we hadn't gone that route, but I would speculate that it is higher.
And in the context of the 140 and the analysis that was conducted to get that number, Mr. Sewell did mention that he'd be interested in seeing a copy of the report. I don't believe I've had that seen that as a board member, but I was going to suggest that that be something that we follow up on. So I'm leaving that on the record as a request that I would make. And perhaps one of your members could walk Mr. Sewell through it if that's helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Molnar. I've just got one follow-up question because you asked a couple of mine. And that's, again, going back to Mr. Sewell's deputation around body-worn cameras and whether or not we're ready for implementation. Any work we may have been doing, Deputy, with regard to the body-worn cameras, consulting with a privacy commissioner, what have you, when they will be turned on, when they won't be turned on, given that we're implementing in the fairly near future. Can you comment on how ready we are?
Yeah, I have our project lead here, Superintendent Mike Barsky. Tony did allude to the fact that we are still in the assessment stage, and a lot of the comments that Mr. Sewell made came from our pilot in 2016, but Superintendent Barsky can give us an idea of what we have been doing and our due diligence to get to today.
Welcome, Superintendent.
Sir, thank you so much. So in relation to your question, sir, our operating procedure was written in consultation from 2015 to today with the Privacy Commission. Not only the Privacy Commission, but the Human Rights Commission, the OIPRD, the SIU, the Ministry of the Attorney General, and any other entity that might have a voice in that. And the operating procedure for activation is specific to the training that's provided to the officers prior to them deploying on the road, which initially was 30 hours of in-class training, which has now been broken down into both online training and in-class training. But the procedure reads, and if I may, activate the body-worn camera as soon as reasonably possible prior to arriving at scene for call, at the decision to initiate any contact with a member of the public, where that contact is for the purpose of a police investigation, regardless of whether or not that person is within camera view, to record statements that would not normally be taken in the field, including utterances and spontaneous statements, to record interactions with the person in custody or a member of the public in a service facility when the officer believes it would be beneficial to do so, and record any other situation or incident where the officer believes capturing video and or audio evidence or information would support the lawful execution of their duties. That's trained to specifically for the officers. It is not at the discretion of the officers. It is mandatory, and they are trained to that. Discretion comes into play on deactivation as to sensitive nature of an investigation, those types of things, but those are very, very limited and very focused.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, Ms. Mulliner?
This is not for Superintendent Barsky, it's actually in relation to the shift schedule. So just to return to that briefly, Acting Chief McLean, I noticed that Mr. Sewell was listening closely to your response around the next stage, which would be to implement it. Perhaps you could just walk us through the shift schedule implementation for 2020. I think you said there was going to be 12 divisions added on, so I'll leave. Thank you.
Greg.
So I'm going to bring up Greg Watts to actually get into more of the details that you ask.
Welcome.
Good morning. Okay, so we currently have 2 divisions, 41 Division and 23 Division, on a pilot with a 12-hour schedule. The external company is a company called Strategic Direction that has been contracted by the Toronto Police Association. It's been an extremely collaborative effort between the service, this board, and the TPA to get us to where we are today, and an extremely robust engagement with the membership as well. Every division has been analyzed, as the CAO said, on an individual basis, so no cookie-cutter approach. Traditionally, what we do is we take service-wide data, and then we just pick 2 divisions. In this case, we've said, just like the acting chief has mentioned, that the city is changing, neighborhoods are also changing, which means our districts and our divisions are changing. So we need to take a more of a granular approach and analyze each division on its own to determine what the best model, what the best staffing model is. So as of January 27th, we will have 12 divisions piloting a new schedule, either a 12-hour schedule that is currently happening in 41 and 23, or a 11-hour schedule, a 7-on, 7-off schedule. So we will have 2 divisions piloting the 7-on, 7-off schedule, and the remaining divisions piloting the 12-hour schedule. And that's going to go live on January 27th.
And do we see the rollout, a further rollout during 2020? Or is the 12 what we're starting with, and we're not sure when the rollout will be for the rest? Just what's the plan?
So we've got 3 divisions that are remaining on the current compressed work week. That's going to be 22 Division, 32, and 51. As we go through 2020, we will be working with the staff superintendents within the field units and the unit commanders to find more efficiencies with the compressed work week, while also working with the association and this board to find other ways to make some changes in shift schedules in those 3 divisions.
Just one question for me. So you will be continually evaluating it throughout 2020 to find other ways that perhaps you can deploy better or differently or what have you, or whether the 11-hour versus a 12-hour needs to be fine-tuned. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. There's an in-depth logic model, an evaluation framework that's going to be going along with this to really kind of capture the efficiencies in terms of the deployment to demand match, as well as costs, and as well as member wellness.
As part of that, I assume you'll be tracking the impact on premium pay as well, the reduction in premium pay?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Ms. Mulliner, do you? Okay, perhaps we can move back to the agenda then. going back to item number 1, which was held. Ms. Molinar, would you like to move item number 1?
I move item number 1, thank you.
And I will second that. That's carried. Item number 2, Ms. Molinar, the capital budget.
I move the capital budget, thank you.
And I will second that. That's carried. And item number 3, Ms. Molinar, the
I
parking
move the
enforcement.
parking enforcement
And I
officer
will-
budget, thank you.
I will second that, and that's carried. Item number 4 was carried earlier, for those of you who weren't here. I'll now move adjournment. Ms. Molinar, would you like to second that?
I second the motion to adjourn, thank you.
Okay, thank you to everybody. That was a lot of work. You did a terrific job. Appreciate it.